All right, welcome to Unit 1 of the Brain and Mental Health. I'm Mr. Van, one of your teachers for the course, and yeah, this is our first time doing an orated video, and hopefully it goes well. This is the first of 10 units we'll be doing. It's kind of the foundation for what we do in the rest of the course. If you don't understand the brain, it's going to be pretty hard to talk about mental health, I would say. Um, Basically, as we go through this, there will be activities that we do in class that I won't touch on so much. This oration is really just to give some additional thoughts and comments that might be useful for when you do your in-class writes or do your class discussions activities. So that's kind of the goal of this. All right, let's get into it. Not really anything to say on this slide. We'll do this activity in class, but it's going to help give us a little bit of a background on what we might already know about the brain and give us some stats that kind of really make you go, whoa. So this is an interesting thing that we might talk about a little bit more in class. This number actually comes from about 2019, just before COVID, as it alludes to. You can see there's 1.4 of a person. There's roughly 21 or just over 1/5 of working adults. So keep in mind this is adults in Canada are currently experiencing mental health problems and illnesses. Now, one of the things we'll talk about in this course is the difference between a mental health problem, a mental health illness, and just mental health generally. For the simplicity of just this slide in particular, understanding that a mental health problem is something that anyone can have, and something that a mental health illness is something that specifically gets diagnosed by doctors, most specifically usually psychiatrists. These are people who've got additional training, or already have done their doctor training and have done specific training in understanding the brain and mental diagnoses. We'll spend lots of time in the course talking about that. 21.4 pre-COVID is particularly important because we know it's higher now, and the study's already coming through, and now 5 years kind of since the dawn of COVID, and more so, we know that these numbers have at peak COVID being as high as a third or even more, and even coming off COVID, there's kind of lingering effects that are coming from this. They also don't encapsulate what's going on for youth. We know that, and we'll learn about this in our Here for Peers presentations that you'll practice on and get good at and share with grade 7s. We know that roughly 1 in 3 youth will have mental health problems, and illnesses will be a much smaller amount of that as youth. But a lot of that is just because some doctors are not too interested in diagnosing, and for lots of good reasons as well, too early. So some youth might be showing the symptoms of mental illness, but maybe aren't going to get diagnosed until later into adulthood or until later into teenagehood. So we know 21.4% is a underrepresented number of what's really going on in the world today. We know that things locally can affect this, such as food insecurity as well in Vancouver. It's a real set of issues that are causing mental health problems and illnesses. A huge factor in this, we'll talk about at various points in the course, is related to challenges that go on around what I call family breakdown. So as the pressures on individuals and parents translate into challenges for families, that naturally creates some challenge that can intensify mental health problems and mental health illnesses for people. So sadly, in the world, despite the fact that our healthcare system is in theory better than any point in human history, it still continues to be a real challenge. All right, this is a big slide, so I might spend just a little bit more time on it. It really is going to lay out the fundamentals of how we understand the brain. Now, you can go into a large amount of detail, and I would encourage students to do some additional research. There's some incredible YouTube videos. There's some great TED Talks. There's lots of wonderful information all over the internet about the different types of the brain and how they interact. So I would encourage you to go a little bit further with that, and we will a little bit further in class as well. But I really want to get onto what I call the 3 parts of the brain. also sometimes called the three layers. And you can see them mentioned right there. There's the reptilian, the limbic, which also is commonly called the emotional, and then the cognitive, which is our thinking, another word for thinking. So easiest way I think to think about these is kind of if you take your hand and you take your thumb, so I got to do this right in the camera. The thumb here is going to be the reptilian part of the brain. It's, if you look over on the anatomy of the brain picture, is going to be closer to the middle. The one going over top of it, this is the limbic or emotional. Okay, and then the other hand is going to go over top, and this is going to be a third one, and this is the cognitive part of the brain. Those three in that order are important to understand. From the perspective of how we came to be and how over not even just human existence, but animal existence over literally hundreds of millions of years, we start from the most important from the perspective of being alive, and we work towards the least important to being alive as we work further out into our cranium. So although it might seem crazy to you to think that if you look at the blue part there, the frontal lobe, which is responsible for things like thinking and language and adding up math, whether you think math is important or not, all of those sorts of things that we use at an incredible level all the time, all of our logic, all of our social understanding, all of our ability to reason comes from these areas on the outside, mostly frontal, and mostly specifically prefrontal right here behind your forehead. But those are actually the least important to our brain. Because if we work out, reptilian is responsible for things like helping to understand and control heart rate, oxygen. It's the thing that just works in the background and has you breathing. It understands how to get rid of things you don't need in your body. That's being and pooping. That's the part of the body that's responsible for the most basic understandings of our body that keep us physically alive. So it's great and all if you can understand a logic problem. It's great and all if you can communicate well to your friend. But none of that matters if you're dead. So the reptilian part is at the center of the brain, because if our brain was to, say, take a hit, imagine, for example, the brain having been developed in the over the last 100,000 years, in particular with humans. If you're going to take a whack across the head 20,000 years ago on the plains of Africa from a lion, I mean, it's probably not going to be great for you. But if you're to survive it, you need to really keep the reptilian brain safe. And if you have to take a hit and it smacks the orbital, that pink one you see, and suddenly that affects your ability to see, not great, but you're still alive. Your motor cortex, that doesn't necessarily show it here, but they're going to also be on the outside and kind of going across here. All of these parts of our body, or our brain that are important but not life-threatening live on the outside, and all of the most core ones live on the inside at the reptilian level. In the middle, represented by that purpley limbic lobe that you can see there, and some other areas that actually run down the brainstem, this is the limbic emotional. Some of the key parts here are going to include the hypothalamus, the amygdala. We talk a lot about the amygdala in this course. The pituitary gland, all working all the way down to the spinal cord. So these parts are responsible for sending messages through our body and specifically understanding threats. This is the part that you may be familiar with fight, freeze, flight, or fight, flight, freeze, that you maybe heard of before. They're the parts that determine whether or not there is a threat or whether or not it's safe, if people can be trusted. When you walk down the street and you randomly come across somebody and they look a little sketchy to you, that's your limbic brain informing your prefrontal cortex and the rest of your cognitive brain. So this is the part that we often refer to as hijacking. So the limbic brain, let me just back up. The reptilian brain just kind of works on autopilot for the most of the time. The limbic part of the brain is what will suddenly take over the cognitive brain and tell it what to do, whether it's safe, whether you can keep doing that math test, or whether you need to start freaking out. Some of the most common reasons that we see anxiety disorders playing out are because of the challenges that we feel we face that might not actually be real, that the limbic brain is telling us are real. So, there's not a bear actually walking into your math class that's actually causing a potential situation in your life that could kill you. However, people can feel anxiety at such a level that it feels as though that is happening. It's not that it's not real, it's just that it's not helpful. So one of the things we can do is, as human beings in this course, and we'll practice a lot of in this course, is trying to help understand how we can use our limbic emotional parts of our brain to inform but not hijack as often the cognitive parts. There will be limits to what we can do with this, but there's lots of things we can do, and we'll talk about them that help. Okay, that was a lot of information, but I think it's really important that we understand the three major parts of the brain, how they are ordered in importance and why they're in our brain in the areas they're in, and also how they interact a little bit. And if you can remember emotional hijacking, that'll be helpful too. This is a video that'll be helpful for helping understand a little bit more about how you can visualize the brain with your hands, as you can see in the starting photo here. And it goes over some of the key parts of our brain and how they interact. It's going to fill in a little bit more of what I was saying last slide. Okay, this is the flight, fight, or freeze response slide. It's building off what we were talking about with the three parts of our brain earlier. This video is going to be quite helpful, and it really helps us understand how the human evolution has happened over the last 25 or even long 100,000 years, and how anxiety works in our body, why it's there, why it's designed this way. It's survival. I'll just give the hint now, and how different human beings respond differently with the fight, flight, or freeze. And we don't all respond the same way each time as well. Any number of us can be some amount fight, some amount flight, and some amount freeze. And different settings and different people will bring out different amounts. And also the likelihood that we will experience the flight, fight, or freeze part of our amygdala is going to be related to how we feel in certain circumstances. You might find some moments in your life much more anxious than others. Some places, physical locations, much more anxiety producing than others. This is true for all of us, and every single human being on the planet who's got a amygdala, which, spoilers, pretty much all of us, has this response. It's just how we control it and how we use it. I think the video will be helpful. All right, I won't say much about this right now, but this is going to be a fun little activity we're going to do where we're actually going to role play out how the brain communicates with each other with four very common parts. Well, three parts of the brain and then extremities of the brain. So we'll play this out. It'll be fun. Okay. An important thing to understand is the difference between stress and anxiety. Now, stress, as we're going to show in this little graph here, is basically when we feel a level of pressure that is requiring us to do something. Now, I think generally human beings, like in the current vernacular, like to think of stress as being bad. But in fact, as this graph kind of shows, and I'll talk to you, stress isn't always bad. We need some level of stress to actually be able to get us to do things. If we don't feel any stress, we're not going to get out of bed. Some people who feel so little stress, which is actually some of what can go with depression, don't even want to get out of bed. If we don't feel any level of stress, then we're not going to be able to engage meaningfully in our life and our surroundings and what's going on. You can see on the green part, kind of the inactive, it's just like you're just existing, you're not doing anything. Now, granted, I want to say that there is perhaps a value statement being made by me that like doing nothing is bad. I suppose it's not inherently bad, but I don't know if it's necessarily going to get you towards your goals for life. Towards the end of the green is the laid back, and then as we get into yellow, we're now in the optimum stress. This is where, and you've all felt this, this is where you know you can do something, but it's in the realm of what you're capable of, and it's pushing you a little bit, but it's not making you feel uncomfortable. An example for me might be if I was to play, I love soccer, so if I was to be playing a soccer game, and we were in a championship game, and I was feeling some degree of nerves, and I had a couple good passes right off the bat, I'm still feeling the stress of wanting to do well in the game, but I'm in a place where I've got some belief. I'm in my place where I've got interest in doing well and where it's pushing me to accelerate my skills and do better. So when you're in that place where things aren't going badly, but they're still requiring something of you, this is kind of optimum stress. It's also like if you write a science test and you know it's a pretty tough test, but you've studied a lot. You know you have to follow through and you know you have to do well on it, but it's not it's not overwhelming because you never studied it all. You have no idea what's going on in the course material. When that's the case, that might look more like getting into the orange zone. Although an important thing to understand in the orange zone is that this is, as it kind of says with exhaustion, this is where it's happening for sometimes a more prolonged amount of time. So one thing we want to think about with stress is just like how much stress and can we manage it, but also how long is the stress going for? The longer the stress is going for, the more exhausting it is. At some point, we get into the red zone, which is where it just becomes overwhelming. It's too much. We can no longer manage it, and something gives. Now, in this particular one, you'll notice it starts to say it's anxiety, panic, and anger. That is true, but I want to put a little asterisk here. I think it's important to understand and speak to one other thing between anxiety and stress here, and that is that stress is a natural response to our surroundings that with time and with difficulty can eventually become overwhelming. Anxiety is different, and we'll talk about this a lot during the course, but anxiety is more about whether or not our mind and our body are productively responding to the stress, or whether we're having unhelpful and unnatural, maybe, responses to it. Anxiety isn't necessarily rational. We can rationalize it in our minds, but it's not rational itself. Stress is very rational. It is a function of what happens in an environment that is stressful. So we'll go into this in more details now, but I just want to kind of lay this out. There's the graph for stress, and there's also kind of a little bit of understanding of where stress and anxiety are different. Okay, so this photo actually comes from somewhere called Camosun Bog. You may have heard of it. It's out west towards Lord Byng. Really cool spot. Lots of indigenous people have a lot of value for the Musqueam people. This is a particularly important area and site. And it's also filled with nature, and it's filled with green. And I just wanted to use this picture from a Pro D I did like a year ago, a year ago or so, to understand how brains develop. So this was really interesting, and I learned about this from the indigenous knowledge keeper who was talking about it. And essentially, I'd ask you to count, and in a moment you can, how many different greens can you see? What's interesting about human beings and greens is that we can see the difference between more greens than any other color. Why might that be? Pause for effect. If you guessed that it's because we've spent most of our existence in nature, and so our eyes have come to train differently with different greens, and combined with the fact, and this is really interesting, some greens signal some plants that may be poisonous or unpoisonous, and other greens could be poisonous or unpoisonous differently. So being able to separate the different greens has been crucial for human beings to be able to survive and thrive over thousands of years. It doesn't matter so much unless you're randomly stuck in the wilderness now, which obviously we do. People love hiking. But for most of us, this isn't nearly as important anymore. And so what we're noticing now as we've really become more domestic as people is this is not something that we are giving priority, and over a long time, it's not going to be your kids, but over your kids, you might find that the ability to see different greens will actually diminish. Our brain is constantly making value judgments about what's important and what's not important, and that gets passed on through our genetic material to our offspring over thousands of years. And so what was important to us now, texting on a phone, will eventually be easily embedded into us in the future. So an interesting piece about greens that just kind of speaks to how brain development is over a long period of time, and how we can understand a lot about our brains from what was important thousands of years ago. This is why I give the Africa savanna lion example. Okay, this is a cool video that I'll let you just watch about neurons, neuroplasticity, and brain wiring. The important thing that I kind of alluded in the text right there to really keep an eye on is separate to all the different parts you're going to learn about that are cool. And if you like this kind of stuff, take the Anatomy and Physiology Bio 12 class. It's got tons about the brain and about the actual biology of it. But for the purposes of our class, what we want to understand is how brain wiring works. So as I kind of allude to and say in the words there, your brain is making decisions about what you think is important, whether you're an active participant in this or not. If I decide, I'll use lots of soccer examples this course, I'm sure. If I decide to put hundreds of hours into developing kicking with my left foot, as I'm a right foot dominant person, that is going to be something that my brain is going to build neural pathways, and it'll talk about this a bit, so that I can improve and continually get better. We've all seen this. You practice something, you get better at something, as long as you're practicing correctly. What's important to understand is, sure, we can do that, and we can have cognitive control over what we are becoming better at, but also it's important to understand that the little parts of our life where we're not taking active control of something, our brain is still taking feedback from us, whether we realize it or not. So, for example, if I am constantly, I use tests a lot as well, I suppose. If I am constantly getting anxious, my stress is becoming irrational, it's becoming anxiety in my English in class writes, let's say. If I'm not doing anything about that, my brain is actually wiring to continue to feel that way and to accept that reality. So by not doing something, the brain is still wiring. The brain is constantly wiring, and it's also pruning, which is something you're going through as teenagers right now, where it's deciding what's more important. And so I really think the important takeaway from here, and the video will touch on it slightly as well, is to understand that we need to be actively thinking about what we want our brain to get better at. Because if we don't put the work in, it'll happen either way. Okay, so we're going to do a couple slides here, just kind of segueing between the brain and our unit 2, which is emotions. They really go hand in hand, and they're going to really play off that limbic system we alluded to earlier. Now, this particular slide and a number of things in this course are built off some of the understandings that somebody wonderful named Brene Brown put forward over the last 20 years or so in her research. She's a social worker and does a lot of like social psychology kind of things. Has written some books, seen some TED Talks. You may have heard of her. She's big on understanding empathy. We'll get to that later. Now, why we're talking about this right now is to really understand that when we go into that limbic part of our brain and we talk about what all these emojis that I've put up there, and you probably could name probably all of them. In fact, maybe at the end of this, see if you can give a word or a phrase to each of them. I bet you could probably do 80% of them or more. To understand that our emotions are a function of how our limbic system sees the world, and that there are influences that go into that. So not everybody, here's the key thing, not everybody sees the same event the same. And in fact, arguably, no two people ever will see the same event the same. I could go watch the Canucks win the Stanley Cup. Probably not going to happen. Watch the Canucks win the Stanley Cup, and the guy next to me might have a completely different experience than I will. And it's going to be because of factors that Brene and others have kind of laid out. So I've got them right here. Think of them, as I say, as like filters. So the first one is biology. So our biology is literally the DNA that's been passed on from our biological parents. This has an effect. We know it has an effect on mental health and mental illness. We used to think it had a huge effect, and in fact was almost the entirety of understanding mental illness, but we now have learned that that's not the case over the last 40, 50 years. That's come out to not be entirely true. But biology, what's literally been passed along from DNA from your biological parents. Okay, now your biography is, if you think about a biography and autobiographies and books, biography is essentially the story that you're writing of your life. So emotions, and this is really interesting and I think important to understand, emotions fit in through how we are writing the story of our life. Now, whether we're doing this consciously, most of us aren't, or unconsciously, and then think about it once in a while, which is what most of us do, it's happening. I would encourage you to think about, what are the stories of my life? What are the things that I think kind of cross all the threads that explain who I am and what's important to me and what I think? The reality is that sometimes we might not actually like some of those things, but they are still narrative stories that explain our existence and who we are and who we think we are. Give me one second. Apologies. So that's biography, the stories of our lives. Now, behaviors. These are the go-to things that people do when they're having certain emotional responses. Some people, you may have noticed, just seem like they're angry more often. Some people seem like they're just joyful more often. All of these things are going into how we will make sense of the world around us. And then the last one is the backstory. Backstory is essentially what's happened in your life so far. People who've experienced more trauma are going to have a backstory that's going to probably negatively affect their ability to regulate and understand their emotions, and they might more easily jump to emotions that they don't want. Contrarily, if I've gone through most of my existence to this point and I've not had to face trauma, and I don't want to say trauma is the only way of understanding backstory, it's just the biggest effect probably on it, I'm going to have a completely different backstory that's going to change how I see emotions and change how I respond to situations. The behaviors. So your biology, what's passed on from parents, your biography, the stories you tell yourself, your behaviors, which are how you respond to things, the go-to things you do when certain events happen, and your backstory are going to all affect how you interpret the world and what emotional responses you have to things. This is really important to understand. And I want to pair this with, as you can see, I kind of allude to in the bold up there where it says the emojis are bad feelings we don't want. Well, it's important to understand that emotions aren't good or bad. We may or may not want them, but they themselves are not good or bad. There's absolutely a time to feel anger, and we shouldn't be ashamed, and we shouldn't not want that. There's also, it also would be bad if we spent our whole lives just feeling joy. We need a wide variety of emotions, and we need to understand why we feel them. Okay, well, I kind of did that thing where you speak to the next slide before you actually get to it, but this is kind of just speaking to what I was finishing off on that last slide. The understanding that all emotions serve a purpose, and we need to be able to understand ourselves in order to understand why we feel certain emotions. Some of us feel some emotions way more than other people, and those 4Bs are going to go into why exactly that is. Why is that important? Well, if you ever want to change your emotional responses to things, which is an element of therapy that we'll talk about later in the course, in probably unit 8 or 9. If you want to be able to do that, you need to understand the inputs that get you to feeling impatient or confused or shy or bossy or whatever it is that you might not be wanting to feel in that moment. Okay, so remember, there's not good or bad emotions, but sometimes there's emotions we don't want and there's emotions we do want. And being able to understand how we get to those emotions is going to be crucial in understanding how we can change when we feel certain emotions and our responses to those emotions. That basically wraps up the brain. Thanks for following along. I see I've just under 30 minutes here at about 28. I'll make a conscious effort to make sure they're all under 30 minutes.